Okay, let me try and think of the administrators that were going
Okay.
on back then. Okay,
Thank you.
sure.
Ellen Wetzel, thank you.
Well, Alan, I would like to say, since you were talking about ethics, I would buy a car from you. Usually I start by asking if you can hear me, but since the podium is high and I'm so short, can you see me? I will begin. I had a surprise, so I'm shaking a little bit. My daughter Shayna came, who lives out in Springfield, Pennsylvania, which I totally did not expect. She was supposed to come tomorrow. So,
Are you Shayna?
Yes.
so
We have a
thank you all
Shayna
for
too.
being here, and Shayna too. And Shayna, you'll be really surprised by this. When Rabbi Feshbach asked me to speak about my being Jewish, I thought, how can I explain this feeling? It was like me asking my daughter Shayna how she managed to take care of twin babies and never having children before. Shayna's response was much the same as I feel about my Jewishness. Mom, she said, I never knew anything else. So I also say, I never knew anything else. So how do I begin to describe myself? From the time that I was a young child, I remember reading anything Jewish theme related that I could get my hands on. Chaim Potok, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Leon Uris, Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, on and on were the stories of my life that I could or wanted to relate to. I looked forward to spending time with those stories and those authors who wanted to share with me what I wanted to know. I think most of this feeling was because my parents came from the world that many of these writers talked about, my parents both being from Poland. But my parents themselves never talked a lot about their younger background very much, so I had to become friends with my cherished writers. Oh yes, I knew that my parents were both Holocaust survivors, first being born and living in Poland, then meeting in Austria after the war, then coming to America together, but I didn't really know what that meant. So I read, and I read, and I read, and oftentimes I imagined that I was the woman wearing the sheitel on my head, cooking on the stove like Goldit and Fiddler on the Roof, or carrying pails of water from the town well. I would have imagined that it was my grandmother doing those things, but thanks to the Holocaust, I never had the opportunity or chance to experience knowing any extended family, so I couldn't relate to that. My own children are so lucky. As long as I can remember, I felt Jewish through and through, and everyone who knew me and still knows me seems to think about me that way. There was never a question about my being Jewish that I needed an answer for. Even when I was in kindergarten and a classmate asked if she could see my horns. I didn't show her because I didn't really know what she was talking about. And I didn't ask my parents because their English wasn't good enough to understand something like horns on a child. Well, so much for growing up on a chicken farm in Mays Landing with parents and a 5-year-old who didn't understand the subtleties of misguided beliefs. We were all from chicken farming families, all us Jewish kids on our street coming from immigrant families whose parents had lived through the Holocaust too. We chicken farmed on Route 50 in Mays Landing, in an area that some people, but not any of us Jewish kids or parents, called Laureldale. Growing up, I would never have associated Route 50 with a name like Laureldale, and to this day, I still don't. We had a tiny shoal on Route 50 that all of our parents had gotten together to build, and we all walked to Hebrew school, picking up kids all along the way as we walked. My brother and all the boys on Route 50 had their bar mitzvahs in our little shoal with a luncheon afterwards. There were no bat mitzvahs that I can remember for any of us girls. Today, our little shoal on Route 50 is a church, which I really like since it's still a house of worship. It was normal for all of us kids, some born in Europe, like my brother, born in Salzburg, Austria after the war, and us American-born Yiddish-hearing and Yiddish-speaking kids to be asked if we wanted a piece of brisket, or chopped liver, or gefilte fish, or chicken soup at any time of the day. You could not go to any house on Route 50, including our home, and not find all of that in every refrigerator of every Holocaust survivor's home. Even when I got married, my husband David thought it was a religious custom to have a piece of chicken every night. He didn't know that first year of marriage that was all I knew how to cook. Oh, and we also every night ate a grapefruit that was cut in half with a little maraschino cherry in the middle. David thought that was a religious custom too. So let's talk about eggs and how we all had chicken coops behind our houses and learned how important it was for the chickens to not get sick or killed by some wild animal, because that was our livelihood. If we got sick, it was one thing, but the chickens, no, that was not so good. We all learned how to candle eggs and how to collect eggs in those days, and we all had wire baskets all over the place to collect eggs from the coops that to this day, when I see those wire baskets, it reminds me of our life on the farm. I think people now think it's cool to have a wire basket like that because it's considered vintage. But for us Jewish kids, it was an accessory that none of us lived without on the farm. My Jewish journey, as Rabbi Feshbach asked me to speak about, took me to many places in my life. I went to Ramat Aviv, Israel, to study at the University of Tel Aviv for a year. Then I backpacked in Europe for a month before returning home with Jewish friends whom I had met during that year in Israel. In Europe, we seeked out many Jewish memorials, like the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. This was especially amazing and moving to me, since I had the acting lead role of Anne Frank in our high school production a year before, half acting, but mostly really feeling the part. When I graduated with my master's degree in social work, I got a position at Jewish Family Services in Scranton, working with the wave of Russian Jews who were granted immigration in the late 70s and early 80s. In those years at Jewish Family Services, I resettled 18 Russian newcomer families, speaking Yiddish with every one of the older immigrants. My father was particularly proud that he had spoken to my brother, sister, and I only in Yiddish, and that was probably the biggest reason I got hired for that job. He used to say, English du gehst auslernen, nur Yiddish du darfst auslernen, meaning English you will learn because we were in America, but Yiddish you must learn. And during those Jewish Family Service years, I also spent a lot of time eating Russian cooking, like stuffed cabbage and learning what matryoshka dolls were. When the Richard Stockton College of New Jersey started their Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide program, there I was in the audience with my husband David at the convocation that the college had to officially welcome the program into the college. I was very proud to be in the very first class offered in that program and went on to get my master's degree in Holocaust and Genocide Studies just for me, not for my job. I found joy and sorrow in learning, and I never wanted to stop taking classes. I only took one class per semester and finally graduated, but I wanted to keep taking classes forever because the more I learned, the less I knew. I continue to go to as many classes and lectures offered as I can and have gone on several study trips to Europe and Washington and anywhere I might be able to continue to learn about where my parents were from. Thank you to Franklin Littell, Dr. Franklin Littell, for being one of those people who started the program and nurtured and honored the need for all of us to learn about the Holocaust. I can't explain it, but so many times if I'm in a room with 50 people who I don't know, and there is another Jewish person in the room, somehow we find each other. I don't know how or why, but there's a common thread to our existence. There's a connection, a connect-the-dots type of relationship that I always find meeting another Jew. It becomes a connection of questions that Jews do so naturally. Do you belong to a synagogue? Do you speak Yiddish? Do you read Hebrew? Do you like hearing new tunes? Do you like old familiar ones during a synagogue service? Are your parents survivors? On and on and on it goes for us. And for each new connection that we find, there's a joy that we share. I recently read about someone who said that when they meet another Jew, there are no spaces between them. I realized when I read that that's how I feel, that although my experience may be very different from another person, a Jew, as a Jew, there are no spaces that we can't close. When I had to write today, when I had to speak today, when I was asked by Rabbi Feshbach, I asked my husband David, what makes you think of me as a Jew? And he said it was my desire of honoring my mother and father by following in their Jewish footsteps that keeps me grounded. He said that my devotion to Judaism is because I honor the family members whom I've known, like my parents, but also the ancestors whom I've never met, so many killed during the Holocaust. I really thought about that and about how when I say the Misha Berach, I think of Rabbi Geller saying before every Misha Berach, we pray not only for those we've personally lost, but for the millions of Jews who lie in unmarked graves, who have no one to say Kaddish for them. So it becomes our collective responsibility to say Kaddish for them as well. It's really true in my heart that when I say the Misha Berach, I do think of my immediate family members who lie in marked graves, but also those unmarked graves. My grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, none of whom I've ever had the chance to know. And I think about how they do have someone to say Kaddish for them, me. Our dear friend of almost 50 years, our friend Joe, who is a very devout Catholic, became a supporter of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum because of his connection to my family. He says that I am Jewish because of my parents and all survivors' strength. Joe says that I never take my faith for granted, and I try to connect myself to help people realize not to take anything for granted. Joe said that my family history and the history of all Jews is one of great sacrifice, and that those roots run deep. Our dear friend as well, Mary Ann, once an ordained nun, told me once that the seeds of my parents' trauma were planted in me from conception, and I live with this every day of my life as a Jew and honor this obligation of what they went through. Without even trying, my Jewishness comes out. After working with people for many, many years, my coworkers could be heard saying, "Oi," "Oy vey," or "puh-puh" at different times. I puh-puh everything. They didn't realize it, but I had taught them to be careful about that evil eye, just in case. My mother used to puh-puh our casino money, but it didn't do much good because we never won big. Her puh-puh skills were a little weak for casino winnings, but we still had her do it, as I said, just in case. So this is all part of my blessed Jewish journey. My journey gives me so much joy, whether singing Yiddish songs in the car, which my kids and grandchildren love, when singing songs like Sei still, mach nicht kein Gewalt, der Rebbe geht schon tanzen bald, or celebrating Passover with my family, or lighting Hanukkah candles, or observing Shabbos in synagogue, or hearing an unexpected oi at just the right time. I don't know where my journey will take me, but my love in being a Jew will travel with me always.
Aww.